Planchette is the name of a curious machine whose ability, without any voluntary action on one's part, to write down on paper an answer, not necessarily the proper answer, to any question, has during the past week excited the amusement and astonishment of those who have witnessed its performance. From an article in the Burlington Times, Saturday, April 4th, 1868. Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris.
And I'm Jen.
So, Jen, I haven't told you what we're talking about today.
No. I'm excited.
This is one of those instances where I really fall down a wormhole. Mm-hmm. But this wormhole was inside another wormhole, which was inside another wormhole. So remember several weeks ago when I mentioned there's this person who had did some interesting stuff with Ouija boards in 1918. Yes. And I was watching a YouTube video of Johnny Carson from the 70s, and the guest, who was a magician, mentioned this person briefly. Mm-hmm. I looked her up, and then I've been reading this book about her. And so this weekend, it's a long weekend, I was like, okay, I'm going to finish reading this book and then work on this episode. And so in standard me form, I sit down to read the book. I read half a page and I'm like, this story talks about Ouija boards a lot. I think we should really do an episode about Ouija boards first. So, having read half a page, I'm like, all right, Ouija boards, that's cool. We'll just do an episode about it, knock it right out. Mm-hmm. And so then I start doing the thing that I love to do, which is search Ouija boards in historical newspaper databases and just kind of get the lay of the land, see what people were talking about, when they were talking about these things, etc., etc. Mm-hmm. I start saving articles, making folders. Mm-hmm. One thing leads to another. And I'm like, okay, this is fine. It's a little bit bigger than a one episode topic. So we can have 4 episodes about it. And here are the buckets that everything fits into. So I was like, okay, the first episode will be about the invention of the Ouija board. The second episode will be about Ouija mania, which is what they called exactly what it sounds like. Yeah. People got really obsessed with Ouija boards, and a little bit about spiritualism at the time and the spiritualist movement. And then we can have an episode about Ouija board crimes, because I found a lot of interesting Ouija board crimes.
Oh, amazing.
And then we can have something about art and how it relates, how people have claimed to get art dictated to them, whether it's music or fiction dictated to them from a Ouija board. And then that'll lead perfectly into this other thing. Mm-hmm. So then I sit down and I start getting together my notes on the invention of the Ouija board. And well, then I was like, okay, this is enough for an episode. And then I look and I'm like, well, I haven't gotten to the Ouija board.
Oh my god.
So I got to a thing that inspired Ouija boards. I was Amy came in as I was researching, and I was telling her about it. And she was like, you could probably write a book about this at this point. And I was like, maybe I will. Maybe that's what this is leading to. I hope that other people are interested in Ouija boards. Because...
I am. I'm very interested.
Right?
So that's one person.
There we go. That's all that matters.
Yeah.
So it was kind of interesting. I mean, obviously it's extremely interesting to me, the history behind the Ouija board and what came before the Ouija board, because there's this thing called the planchette, which I know what a planchette is, or I thought I knew what a planchette is. It's the little triangle thing on the Ouija board that you put your fingers on. Mm-hmm. Well, that planchette is named after this other thing called a planchette, which is what I want to talk about today.
Cool.
But just to lay the groundwork a little bit for this story. So Ouija boards and spiritualism in general became a thing in the second half of the 19th century. Mm-hmm. So spiritualism and the spiritualist movement happened after the Civil War in America. It was started by these 3 sisters in 1848 in upstate New York, the Fox sisters.
Oh.
Yeah, and this is fodder for another episode. I want to talk a lot more about spiritualism. It's something I'm very interested in, particularly the connections between spiritualism and queerness and women and how it empowered women at the time, etc. But just to give you the SparkNotes version of this, the 2 younger sisters claimed that they could communicate with the dead and interpret these knocking sounds or rapping sounds as messages from the dead.
Oh my god, that's so cool.
Yeah. So the older sister kind of like managed their talent and made them famous. And the younger sisters were like the mediums.
Oh my god. This could be the like TV show, movie. Like, I mean, I feel like because there was Charmed, there's Hocus Pocus, and they're all like 3 witches. It's always like the same kind of thing. Or 2 witches. That's cool.
Yeah, I mean, I really wonder, this could have, you know, inspired a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And it is kind of surprising that there hasn't been some like Kristen Stewart movie or something about this, right?
Yeah.
I was just thinking about her with the Lizzie Borden movie.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And who knows? For all I know, maybe there has been a movie and I'm not aware of it. But so they were really famous. They kicked off this whole huge movement. And, you know, this was after the Civil War. A bunch of people had died.
Yeah.
And there was this huge interest in people wanting to be able to communicate with the dead and to also feel like their life has meaning. You know, there's not just the materialist plane. There's this other place where people go when they die.
Yeah.
And we can talk to them. I mean, obviously people were very Christian at the time, but probably the spiritualist movement meant that they needed a little more convincing that there was an afterlife, like after a time as terrible as the Civil War. The Fox sisters, in I think 1888, in the late 19th century, one of them confessed that it was all a hoax.
Oh.
And they had trained themselves to like crack the knuckles of their toes to make these loud rapping sounds and like crack their joints. It's really gross. But that's how they did it.
Oh my god.
And that's not to say that the entire spiritualist movement was a hoax. It just means that like they were hoaxing.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, kind of who can blame them? There wasn't much that women could do back then.
Yeah.
But their story is pretty sad because they end up dying like penniless.
Aww.
And one of them ends up with like a drinking problem. Things don't end up well for them. And I think 1 or 2 of them are buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. And then I think one of them is buried in Cypress Hills Cemetery, also in Brooklyn. So they're still nearby.
Yeah. Wow. That's cool.
So that was what started the spiritualist movement and kind of like how people became really interested in this idea that you can talk to the dead. At the time, you know, there were a lot of mediums and stuff. But people also started to get interested in things that they could do at home or like at parties to talk to the dead. And I think that's kind of like our association with Ouija boards, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
I don't know about you, but like when I think of Ouija boards, I think of like slumber parties in 6th grade.
Me too.
Or whatever.
Yeah, me too. We did that. We would make our own with like pieces of paper and draw the letters on them and stuff like that.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Did you ever find that it worked?
I mean, I don't know. There was one time we did it at a friend's house and there was some creepy experiences where my friend felt something grab her leg and she's not like into that stuff. So she freaked out. And then later I was in the room by myself getting my bag. And as I was leaving, my friend had this door that opened into the backyard, and it opened as I was leaving the room, and I jumped over the bed to get out of the room because I didn't want to go near the door.
Right. That's so freaky.
Yeah, it freaked me out.
Did you ever use like the Ouija boards that you get like, I don't know, like a board game type thing, or did you just use the homemade kind?
Yeah, we just made them.
I've only used a Ouija board once, I think, and it was a middle school slumber party. It was extremely fake. Like I really didn't want to participate because I'm somewhat superstitious.
Yeah.
I was a lot more superstitious then. Like now I feel like I know more about things and feel more confident about what I should be superstitious about and what I shouldn't be. Although I'm undecided on Ouija boards still. And I remember like my friend was like, oh, like tell us who you have a crush on. And she definitely wanted like just to be able to like push the planchette so that like it was like, oh, this person likes you or whatever. Which was very sweet in retrospect that she like really wanted me to like say who I liked so she could like say, oh, that person likes you. But also like I was really not into it and really didn't like it. And that I think is the only time I've ever used a Ouija board.
Yeah.
I was like we were staying with some friends in Philly like in February, and they had a Ouija board and we're like, ooh, do you want to play with it? And I was like, I don't know. I think I need to know more about it.
Yeah, I'm more suspicious of them now.
I'm sure the more I research this, the more interested I'm going to be in using it. I'm already like, oh man, why didn't we use the Ouija board in February? Even though I've heard I feel like I've heard equal amounts of people being like, don't use it, do use it, like people in occult circles.
Yeah.
But I feel like if you approach things in a spirit of respect and knowledge, you'll probably be okay.
Yeah.
But also, what do I know?
Yeah.
So, the Ouija board. Before Ouija, there was Planchette. And Planchette was a sort of automatic writing device. So, do you know what automatic writing is?
Yeah, I have heard of that.
It's also called psychography or psychography. I don't know how you say that. I only have ever seen it written down. So verbally, I always hear people just say automatic writing.
Yeah. So that's the technical, the sciencey term for it, I guess.
Yeah, sciencey, pseudoscience.
Yeah.
The fancy term for it. It's when somebody writes something basically without consciously writing. And that's a big topic. And I know a lot of artists and stuff have used it. Skeptics have written automatic writing off as being an example of the ideomotor phenomenon. I don't know if I said that right. It's ideomotor.
Oh, I haven't heard of that.
Idiometer? Ideomotor?
Idiomotor.
I don't know how you say that. I don't know how to pronounce things, especially when I haven't heard them said out loud. Yeah, but same. I also can never figure out the pronunciation guides on Wikipedia or on the dictionary.
Yeah.
I don't know what an upside down E means.
No, me either.
But basically this phenomenon is involuntary muscle movements, almost like reflexes, that can kind of move whatever object you're touching. And I totally think this is a thing. My hands shake like nobody's business. I constantly am holding a cup and then I drop it.
Yeah.
I think I probably have more problems than the average person. But still, I think that this probably is a thing.
Yeah.
And this comes up a lot when people talk about Ouija boards, why the planchette moves, the automatic writing device planchette, dowsing, that kind of stuff. And I don't want to get super sidetracked and get into this now, but I don't really see why this phenomenon proves that automatic writing or spirit board communications, etc., are wrong. Because who's to say that whatever entity you're communicating with isn't causing those involuntary movements?
Oh, that's true. Exactly, yeah.
Maybe your hand always would move involuntarily,
yeah.
But who's guiding it to move that certain way?
Yeah.
If it is automatic, almost like a reflex, it's not your conscious mind doing that.
Yeah.
And maybe it really is just I don't know, your brainstem or whatever, wherever those impulses come from. But also, if you're having a conversation, I don't see why it couldn't be caused by, whatever entity you're communicating with. But that's kind of a whole other ball of wax. I've had to try so hard to make myself focus on this because every topic this touches on, I'm oh, I'm so interested in that. And I'm no, I can't research that right now. I have to stay focused. So automatic writing in general has been around for a really long time. There was actually a Taoist method of spirit writing called Fuqi that was used during the Ming Dynasty in China.
Oh, wow.
So that was the Ming Dynasty was 1368 to 1644 CE or AD, whatever you want to call it. And it involved suspending a sieve or a tray to guide a stick that wrote in sand or in incense ashes.
Oh.
But even before that, spirit writing was popular in China as long ago as the 400s.
Whoa.
CE. And again, not going to go down a wormhole here, but I did want to mention this because I don't want people to think that white European people invented automatic writing or spirit writing, etc. This has been a thing for a long time elsewhere. And I don't think it actually became a thing in Europe until the 1600s. It was used by practitioners of Enochian magic.
Oh, wow.
In the 1600s. And I think that that's when it became a thing in Europe. So the planchette was a device that was shaped like a rounded triangle or like a heart. And so on the broad side, there were two wheels. And then on the pointy side, there was a hole. So you put a pencil through the hole. And then you put the device on a piece of paper, and everybody puts their hands on it, like they would a planchette on a Ouija board today. And then you ask a question, and you see what the planchette writes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The planchette here was much larger than the planchette used in a modern Ouija board, there were a bunch of different measurements that were given, but it sounds like they were usually around 7.5 inches long or 8 inches long and like 5.5 to 6 inches wide.
Oh, okay.
On the broad side. And then on the pointy or narrow side, it was about 2 inches wide. I found this really fun pamphlet from 1904, which is skipping ahead a little bit in time. But the pamphlet was called Crystal Gazing, Astrology, Palmistry, Planchette, and Spiritualism.
Oh,
and it had... Right? It's such a cool... I'll have to send you the link to it.
Yeah.
I found it, I think, on archive.org, and it's such a fun little pamphlet that looks like it's from, like, the 1960s or something, but it's actually from 1904.
Wow.
I mention it because it kind of talks about how to use a planchette. So it claims that they could be used by 1, 2, or 3 people. It recommended that you start off by asking yes or no questions, and then once you've gained some experience and gotten used to it, you can ask questions that have longer answers. The pamphlet had a nice description of using the planchette. Very soon, it will be found that by some mysterious power, which the operators are quite sure they do not themselves exert, the planchette will begin to move about up and down the paper for some little time. Then, generally, an answer will be found written to the question asked. The most mysterious part is, while the operators are lightly touching the planchette with the ends of their fingers and are quite unconscious in any way of influencing its movement, it will move around with more or less rapidity, and will write words and sentences with more or less distinctness. I really like the more or less. More or less.
It might work, it might not, you know.
If it doesn't work, you're probably doing it wrong.
Yeah, it's your fault.
Maybe you're asking complicated questions.
Yeah, your intention is incorrect. Yeah.
So the planchette, I read in one place that it might have been inspired by early prototypes of the telegraph, because I guess there was an early prototype that Morse did that involved like attaching a pencil to something and kind of having it write out the message. There's this website called mysteriousPlanchette.com, which if people are interested in this, I highly recommend going to because it has a lot of really cool info and pictures, and it's very meticulous and really cool. But planchettes were popular in Paris first, it sounds like. It sounds like these started in France, which makes sense because planchette is a French word. It means little plank.
Aw, that's so cute.
It's very adorable.
Yeah.
It's a little bit unclear to me who exactly originally invented the planchette. A bunch of different people claim credit, but it sounds like it was invented in France during a seance on June 10th, 1853. Somebody tied a pencil to an upside-down basket, and they used it, you know, like they would use a planchette, and that seemed to work pretty well. And it was also a lot less exhausting than calling out all the letters of the alphabet and waiting for a rap in response, which is what they were doing before, which sounds like a nightmare.
Not very effective.
Can you imagine? That's kind of supposedly where it began, but also it makes sense that so many different people kind of seem to have the same idea at the same time, because it's sort of similar to the idea of table tipping, which was a seance, not really device, a seance thing where, you know, you'd be like sitting at the table, and I think the way it would work is like you would say something. I think you'd go through the alphabet in a lot of cases, and the table would like tip at certain letters or whatever. So it makes sense, you know, all these people have their hands on the table for that. It makes sense, you know, that there's this thing where everyone has their hands on a device that's giving you a message from the dead and or a hoaxer. Yeah. Because I feel like there's been so many debunkings of table tipping and all the like weird devices people used to like make the table move. So in 1853, which is the same year as that seance, a German composer and music teacher filed a patent for a psychograph, and that was filed in London, and he called it a apparatus for indicating persons' thoughts by the agency of nervous electricity. Oh. Which is, you know, a little longer than saying psychograph, but much more fun. So it involved putting your hands on plates that were attached to a pointer, which would point at letters. And so, you know, planchettes became more and more of a thing. It was kind of iterated on. And in 1853, that same year, planchettes had become so popular in Europe that the Bishop of Viviers wrote a pastoral letter against them.
Oh.
So it's wild that it like escalated that quickly.
Very
like that's
quickly.
all 1853.
Yeah.
And, you know, they're pretty easy to make, right?
Yeah.
Like you just need like a board and some wheels and a pencil
Mm-hmm.
and the ability to, you know, put them together. But so, you know, the church started to speak out against it. And also, interestingly, mediums started saying, oh, you know, people really shouldn't use planchettes or other devices like that. You know, you shouldn't be playing around with this at home. You don't know what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
But they had a really obvious ulterior motive because it threatened their monopoly on spirit communication and seances.
Yeah.
So, you know, it doesn't, and especially because so many mediums at the time were hoaxers, like, and it's been proven.
Mm-hmm.
It's not surprising that they're like, oh, no, don't use that thing.
Yeah.
Pay me.
Yeah.
So that's planchettes in Europe. How did planchettes come to America? So sounds like 1858 or 1859, two spiritualists, Robert Dale Owen and Dr. H.F. Gardner, were overseas. They saw planchettes and they brought some home with them.
Mm-hmm.
Supposedly, Robert Dale Owen communicated with his father using the device, and his father gave him some advice on a book he was writing. I mean, I think, like, if I was talking to a deceased relative, I don't know that, like, I'd be asking for advice on a book.
Me either.
I'd have some other questions.
Yeah.
So many other questions. But, you know, I guess book editorial advice is good, too. So one of these two spiritualist acquaintances, a bookseller in Boston named G.W. Cottrell, Cottrell? Cottrell. I'll say Cottrell.
Mm-hmm.
Started manufacturing them around 1859. For a while, planchettes were kind of quietly selling, but around 1868, the planchette became extremely popular. And at the time, Cottrell was selling planchettes for between $1 and $3, depending on what wood it was made of. So you could get like a plain black walnut one for $1 or a beautifully painted Hollywood one for $3.
A Hollywood one. Ooh.
Yeah, it's the type of wood, not a. I mean, Hollywood didn't exist back then in mid-19th century. And it's interesting too because if you go to that website I mentioned, you can see like pictures of all these different planchettes they've found, and they say that they are not aware of any of those Hollywood ones that have survived to the present day.
Oh.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, it sounds like there's a lot of instances of the cheaper versions of planchettes surviving and the more expensive ones less so. Mm-hmm. Which totally makes sense because, you know, more cheap ones would have been manufactured because there's more people with not much money than there are with a lot of money.
Yeah.
So by 1868, Cottrell said he was shipping thousands of planchettes to all parts of the country. But in a lot of sources, the New York bookseller and toy manufacturer Kirby and Company are credited as the first American planchette manufacturer. They weren't, but they were the ones who probably made it so popular around 1868. So this company, you know, was based in New York. They catered to the wealthy. Mm-hmm. It sounds like particularly wealthy women.
Yeah.
They sold things like expensive soaps, custom embroidered pocketbooks, but they called them porte-monnaie.
Oh, fancy.
To be fancy.
Yeah.
I guess that probably means like a thing to hold money or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
I was really trying to use my French, but my French is not good. It means fancy pocketbook.
Yeah.
In this one instance. And they also sold like other trinkets and games for the wealthy, like croquet and that sort of thing. And because their clientele was so wealthy, that might be why the planchette became so trendy. Because these society people bought them, talked them up, got written about in society pages. Yeah. It became like the new hot thing. And of course, like if a rich person's doing something, it becomes a trend much faster than if like a bunch of poor people are doing things, as far as I can tell. If Instagram is any indication. By December of 1868, Kirby claimed that he'd already sold 200,000 of these planchettes. So they sold numbered models. So number 1, which was made of ash wood, cost $1.50. Number 2 was made of a highly polished wood and cost $3. There's a really awesome picture of their number 3 planchette, which was made out of India rubber, which is basically plastic. And which is pretty ahead of its time, right? Like mid-19th century. Yeah. It looks really cool and really goth. It's shaped like a heart and it's jet black.
Ooh.
And that one was priced at $4.
Wow.
There was one, their number 4, that was made out of plate glass, and that cost $8. And the idea was that users could see what they were writing through the glass.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, although it was a little bit flawed because $8 was a lot of money back then. It was around $144
Oh my god.
in today's dollars. And also, the glass was brittle and prone to breaking.
Yeah.
And also for reference, $1 in 1868 is about $15 today.
Mm-hmm.
So you could get them for anywhere from $15 to $144 in today's dollars. I found also an ad from 1868 that was selling instructions on how to make your own planchette. And these instructions cost 3 cents. And they called it the new parlor mystery. The wonderful little automaton that answers questions, tells fortunes, and can even disclose one's secret thoughts. Any boy can make it.
Any boy.
Any boy.
Even though it was
Only
the women
boys.
that were using it mostly. The
Right,
boys
but
can
we know
make it.
women can't make things.
No, of course not.
So again, like part of their popularity could be that it was also fairly easy to make them. You know, not everyone probably had $1 lying around to burn on it, but you know, 3 cents.
Plus,
for
it was
instructions.
like, it would have provided a lot of entertainment for like between friends and at parties or like in the parlor games, as they said.
Yeah, it was definitely a big thing at parties. And it makes sense, right? Because it's a social activity. You need, in theory, more than one person to do it.
Yeah.
I know that pamphlet from 1904 said that one person could do it, but a lot of sources are like, oh, it's better if you have 2 people. There are a lot of interesting variations on the theme. Like by the 1920s, there were planchettes that were shaped like hands.
Ooh.
Which I find much less aesthetically pleasing, but they're really fun to look at still. Because they're like creepy hands on wheels.
Looks creepy.
With a pencil in the front. So there were also some other spirit communication devices at the time. Like there were these devices that were sort of like clocks that looked cool. But I'm interested in the planchette, one, because of its direct link to the Ouija board, because literally you use a version of a planchette at the Ouija board. And also because of the way people talked about them, which to me is really similar to how Ouija boards have always been discussed and are still discussed today, as if they're either like a game for fools or a weird occult instrument of the devil. Which is still funny to me that people still see Ouija boards that way.
Yeah.
Like it really evokes, I think, a strong reaction in a lot of people. So I looked at a bunch of different books from the 19th century and articles, and I found a lot of interesting accounts of people's experiences with planchettes and like their thoughts about how they work. One weird thing that I noticed in reading all of these things from the 19th century is that they usually refer to planchettes as planchette, capitalized and without an article, as if they're an actual person they're talking to. And sometimes they give planchette a gender.
Oh.
And it's so common that I'm looking at my notes and I'm having to keep correct myself because I started writing planchette as if planchette's a person. I literally, in this sentence, wrote, they often refer to planchette as planchette. And I didn't notice that until just now. And, like, I've started capitalizing it. It's like, I think planchette's a person now, too.
Oh, no, it's happening.
But, right? But it's become, it's like, it's so pervasive in all of this writing. And it's really funny and weird that now I'm doing it.
It's catching on.
So, right, I found this book from 1886 called, so it's kind of a grab bag of topics. It's called The Salem Witchcraft, The Planchette Mystery, and Modern Spiritualism.
Ooh.
I can't really tell who wrote it. Archive.org said it was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, but I am like 99.9% sure that's just an incorrect tagging. It looks like it was edited by the editor of a phrenology journal, which, phrenology was a thoroughly debunked pseudoscience that was generally used to justify all kinds of racism and bigotry back in the day. And it's kind of ironic because the book's introduction is preceded by Webster's dictionary definitions of bigotry, prejudice, and superstition. And the introduction begins, so I guess like the book is a bunch of like reprints of articles from this phrenology journal, I guess interesting ones. So the introduction begins, the object in reprinting this most interesting review is simply to show the progress made in moral, intellectual, and physical science. The reader will go back with us to a time not very remote, when nothing was known of phrenology and psychology, when men and women were persecuted and even put to death through the boldest ignorance and the most pitiable superstition. which is so funny because I think it just says so much about kind of scientific progress or whatever.
Yeah.
Every age thinks that their science is the right science.
Yeah.
And I just like love that where, you know, it's, you know, oh, we in the 19th century with our phrenology are so correct.
Mm-hmm.
And I honestly can't tell the point of view of the book, right? Like the introduction makes it sound like, oh, these are things that are bad in the past. And I get like the Salem witch trials, how that's bad in the past.
Yeah.
But the Planchette section seems to be very pro-Planchette.
Oh.
And it's written by someone who really seems to me to be a true believer. And there's not like an introduction to that section saying, see, look at this silly man who believed in Planchette. Instead, it just like prints this guy's account, which I'll read a little bit of because I found it pretty enjoyable. So he's talking about his experiences using Planchette. For me alone, the instrument will not move. For myself and my wife, it moves slightly, but its writing is mostly in monosyllables. With my daughter's hands upon it, it writes more freely, frequently giving, correctly, the names of persons present whom she may not know, and also the names of their friends, living or dead, with other and similar tests. Its conversations with her are grave or gay, much according to the state of her own mind at the time, and when frivolous questions are asked, it almost always returns answers either frivolous or, I am sorry to say, a trifle wicked.
Ooh.
For example, she on one occasion said to it, Planchette, where did you get your education? To her horror, it instantly wrote, in hell.
Oh. I love that.
But the book wouldn't even spell hell. It just put like H and then 2 dashes and then an L.
You can't even write it. Oh.
On another occasion, after receiving from it responses to some trivial questions, she said to it, Planchette, now write something of your own accord without our prompting. But instead of writing words and sentences as was expected, it immediately traced out the rude figure of a man, such as schoolchildren sometimes make upon their slates. After finishing the outlines, face, neck, arms, legs, etc., it swung around and brought the point of the pencil to the proper position for the eye, which it carefully marked in, and then proceeded to pencil out the hair. On finishing this operation, it wrote under the figure the name of a young man concerning whom my daughter's companions are in the habit of teasing her. So it drew her crush.
Oh my god. It's just like your slumber parties.
Right? It's very Ouija board of it.
Yeah.
And then the book goes through in great detail to talk about theories about what could be causing the Planchette phenomena. And this book is very biased in favor of the Planchette being somehow a real reflection of a paranormal phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
So like the first theory that people say is that, you know, the people who are touching the Planchette are moving it and writing the words. And he tries to refute it saying, how is it, for example, that Planchette, under the hands of my own daughter, has, in numerous cases, given correctly the names of persons whom she has never seen or heard of before, giving also the names of their absent relatives, the places of their residence, etc., all of which were absolutely unknown by every person present except the questioner. And like that comes up a lot, where they're like, oh, well, how did it know? And in some cases that I was reading in different articles and stuff, at least one person who was touching the Planchette did know. And then in some cases, they didn't. So the second theory is that the Planchette works by electricity or magnetism, which I find totally charming. Because I feel like those are just the 19th century things that they're impressed by or that are just thrown out as an explanation.
Yeah.
So nowadays you're like, oh, it's AI. It's the algorithm. It's the cloud.
It's 5G.
I feel like it's 5G. I feel like electricity and magnetism are the 19th century version of that, where like nobody really understands how they work, but you're like, oh, I read about this. I know all about this.
Yeah.
It's magnetism.
Yeah.
And this was a really popular theory about planchettes at the time. And here's what the author says about this, and I actually agree with this. We are tempted to ask, who is electricity? What is his mental and moral status? And how and where did he get his education? Or, if by electricity it is meant simply the subtle, imponderable, and impersonal fluid commonly known by that name, then let us ask, who is on the other end of the wire? For there must evidently be a who, as well as a what in the case. And then also people argued, like, since magnets are used to fake some stuff in seances, they could be used to fake planchette stuff too, which is totally true.
Yeah.
But also, like, how many operators of planchettes as a parlor game, like, not as a money-making enterprise, but, like, people playing it with friends are going to set up a complex system of magnets under their tables just to impress their friends. Mm-hmm. Kind of unlikely.
Yeah.
And I really like the way he was like, well, if it's electricity, why is electricity saying those things?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's a really good question.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's not really a good way to give an answer for that. Because there has to be something on the other side. Otherwise, why is electricity so smart? So the third theory that he puts forth is that it's the devil. Self-explanatory. Mm-hmm. A lot of religious figures at the time were condemning it as being the devil's work, etc. Mm-hmm. So then the fourth theory was like a floating ambient mentality. So he's kind of claiming that it's the consciousness of the people in the room.
Oh.
Which, okay. He goes into a lot of detail explaining it, but I still don't feel like I understand it.
Yeah.
It would make sense to me if he was like, it's each of their individual unconsciousness. Yeah. Or like unconscious. But he's talking about like the assumed floating ambient mentality is an aggregate emanation from the minds of those present in the circle. And I mean, he doesn't think this is the case. And so maybe that's why he makes it sound really weird and unconvincing. Mm-hmm. So the fifth theory is to Dantmonium, the demon.
Oh, geez.
But this is like not the demon in like the way we would mean it nowadays, like the devil. This is more like the demon in that it's like the collective unconscious. He goes into a whole long explanation of philosophers and stuff in antiquity and like Spiritus Mundi, which is like the collective unconscious. And he like cites in great detail this one guy's work, the guy who argued that it was like the collective unconscious or whatever. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of mention of like, I don't know, Greek philosophers and stuff. But I don't really like, sure. Sure. I was trying to read it and understand it, and I was like, I took philosophy in college and I didn't understand it then. I still don't understand it now. I recognize these names as people I didn't understand. Mm-hmm. So the sixth theory was some principle of nature as yet unknown. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Seventh theory was spirits of the dead. Mm-hmm. And then the eighth theory was Planchette's own theory, in which he spends many pages, like probably at least 10 or 15 pages, interviewing Planchette.
What?
So he says, Planchette is intelligent. She can answer questions and often answer them correctly, too. On what class of subjects, then, might she be expected to give answers more generally correct than of those that relate to herself, especially if the questions be asked in a proper spirit and under such conditions as are claimed to be requisite for the correct responses? So then he, like, asks Planchette if he can ask how she works. And, you know, she's like, that will depend much upon the spirit in which you may interrogate me, the pertinence of your questions, and your capacity to interpret the answers. If you propose a serious and careful consultation for really useful purposes, there is another thing which you should understand in the commencement. It is that, owing to conditions and laws which may yet be explained to you, I shall be compelled to use your own mind as a scaffolding, so to speak, on which to stand to pass you down the truths which you may seek, and which are above the reach of your own mind alone. Keep your mind unperturbed, then, as well as your intent upon your object, or I can do but little for you.
Oh.
So the spirit of this I find convincing, but the substance of this, literally, I find unconvincing. And what I mean by that is, like, basically, Planchette is saying, clear your mind and focus your intention.
Yeah.
Which is, like, what anyone would say when using any kind of divination tool. Fine. Mm-hmm. But are we supposed to believe that Planchette dictated all of that?
I know, that's very wordy.
And the reason why I read that whole thing is so you could understand there's pages and pages and pages of this conversation, this interview with Planchette.
Wow.
So many pages. I couldn't even read them all. I just started skimming. And I'm like, truly, like, I don't believe, really, unless this guy is some kind of gifted person, which he's saying he's not gifted in using the Planchette, that she would just, like, dictate out this whole thing through automatic writing. Like, imagine how many times you'd have to change the page for that.
Yeah. Ugh.
That's kind of interesting because, like, I think we're supposed to take this whole cloth. Mm-hmm. That's not very believable.
Mm-mm.
And they end up going into like philosophy, and they talk about the Bible and the Old Testament, New Testament. It's like a very long thing. But I just like found that whole section of that book so like funny and weird. Because this guy was like so desperately defending the reality of this planchette phenomenon in a way that's like pretty amusing. Another amusing thing that I found was in Harper's New Monthly Magazine in volume 38 from 1896, there was an article called The Confessions of a Reformed Planchettist.
Planchettist. Wow.
Planchettist. And it is the most like purple prose dramatic thing I've ever read. I'm like, you know, back in the day, people used to get paid a lot, I think, for writing like articles and short stories and stuff. And I'm like, you know, this guy was really laying it on thick. Because he was like, you know, I can tell this really, what's the word? I don't know. Very dramatic story about me being corrupted by the planchette. And literally the first lines of this article are, I am not wicked. At the worst, I am but weak.
No.
He continues, how did I become a planchettist? How does a man become committed to any evil career? Insensibly and by degrees, of course. No man clothes himself at once with the full measure of guilt as he would put on a ready-made garment. There are gentle gradations in all iniquity. So then he goes on to compare himself with Nero learning to fiddle. And like the famous story is that like Nero fiddled on a hill while Rome burned. And it's like the story of this terrible leader, you know, laughing basically in the face of all these people dying. You know, Nero was like this evil guy who like used Christians as tiki torches at parties and stuff. He was like a bad dude. That's all I can remember about him off the top of my head, but not a good dude. And the fact that this guy's like comparing himself with Nero, this planchettist, is very laughable. So then he continues, certainly, when I first laid confiding and caressing hands on the smooth and shining back of Planchette.
Oh my god, why does it sound erotic?
So sexual. I had no idea of the dark path of deception on which that three-legged monster would drag me, of the depths of turpitude into which I thereby pledged myself to plunge.
Oh my god.
So, like, he goes on to talk about how he was working on an astronomical invention, because everyone in the 19th century was working on astronomical inventions, it feels like. It's, like, very steampunk of him.
Yeah.
He dropped by the shop of a man who made mathematical equipment, and he found that the guy was really busy making pentagraph wheels, which I guess is a type of wheel, for a newly invented writing machine. So he couldn't make him his, you know, item that he needed for his astronomical invention for at least a month. So the author was curious and he picked one up. And, I mean, he personified the planchette as soon as he saw it at this bookstore. He says, there I found Planchette lying in wait for whom he might devour. He was a brown-looking little familiar made of wood and mounted on 2 pentagraph wheels, a lead pencil forming his third leg. He looked as if he might bite, and had an uncanny air about him generally. Inquiring, what is this mystery? I was informed that on 2 persons placing their hands upon the fellow's back, and a question being asked, he would soon begin to wriggle about like a crab in the sand, and would write intelligible, if not an intelligent answer, with his plumbaginous tail.
Oh my god.
It's Plumbaginous. Plumbaginous tail. That means containing graphite.
Oh.
It turns out there's a word for something that contains graphite, and it's that word that I don't know how to say. But again, with the 19th century, like, flowery, like, I will use this highly specific word that I maybe just made up. So then he talks about, like, going on a date with a lady he didn't really like, and he used the board with her, and like, supposedly the board works best when the people using it are opposites, like in gender, complexion, temperament, etc. And supposedly it works better for women than for men. But of course, you know, the board didn't work. So he went to return the board to the store the next day, and the bookseller gave him a refund but said, you know, go ahead and keep the board. And then after that, the board started working.
Oh, bum, bum, bum.
And this article, it's such a money grab. It's so dramatic, so ridiculous.
Yeah.
I didn't feel quite easy at having Planchette for a room fellow that night. I started several times, expecting to find him scratching about and endeavoring to climb into bed with me. I would rather have taken up with a bug. And he talks about its popularity. The mania spread, and the air became full of planchettes. Wherever you went, a board was brought out as soon as the lamps were lit. The soft blandishments of music gave place to its presence, and conversation ceased. The baleful dissipation became universal. The article goes on forever and ever. I just had to start scrolling. I was like, these stories he's telling about the planchette are not that interesting.
Yeah.
They're very detailed. There's a lot of proper nouns.
Yeah.
Because the problem with like so many things, I mean, kind of like what we found with our Estes method experience, you have to talk for a long time to make someone understand why a paranormal thing was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Or, you know, why something they think is paranormal isn't real.
Yeah.
In this guy's case. I really liked his conclusion, which ends with basically him being like, it doesn't work. It's a fraud. I'm a fraud. Which is very silly after the, like, dramatic,
so dramatic,
you know, scary passages.
Turned it into, like, a little creature.
So part of his conclusion is, I have little more to say and surely nothing further to confess. I have truthfully given my experience, and if it be of any use to any of my fellows, that knowledge is guerdon sufficient. I think that's how you say that word. Guerdon. I'll say it's guerdon.
Guerdon.
Guerdon. I looked that up. It means, like, I think, like, a reward or, like, whatever. I don't know. It makes sense sort of in context. A reformed planchettist, I eat better, drink better, and sleep better than when pursuing my evil practices. Let this encourage those who are still under the dominion of the destroyer, capitalized, destroyer, to emancipate themselves. It is useless to tell me that there is anything in Planchette, or that by its aid any man may become its own medium. It would only write when I moved it, and then it wrote precisely what I dictated. That persons write unconsciously, I do not believe. As well tell me a man might pick pockets without knowing it. Nor am I at all prepared to believe the assertions of those who declare that they do not move the board. I know what operators will do in such cases. I know the distortion, the disregard of truth which association with this immoral board superinduces.
So, but like he talks about it like it's a destroyer and it's evil, but it's also not real at the same time. So like,
right. It's so, I mean, that's how you can tell like he just wrote it for like money.
Yeah.
Also, I think that like his argument where it's like, well, people don't pick pockets unconsciously, so they don't write unconsciously. And it's like, well, it's totally different. You can write unconsciously if there's a pen in your hand. Just like, I don't know, if you just walked around all day with your hand in other people's pockets, you might accidentally pick their pockets. But that's not what people do.
No.
People don't just sit with their hand in strangers' pockets. That would be really weird. So his metaphor makes no sense. No. But there was definitely kind of a moral panic about planchettes, especially regarding how women use them and how they supposedly work better for women than men. And I found this great article from 1868 from the New Orleans Republican that tells the story of a young woman dying from planchette. This is the point in my notes, too, where I continued saying planchette instead of the planchette. To read from this article. In the street in which I live, a young lady who was unduly attached to this uncanny game came to her death in consequence. She had shut herself up with it, and regardless of the directions on the downward side of the board that two persons are to operate simultaneously in placing their fingertips upon the upper surface, had endeavored for hours at a time to get a response to certain questions she had asked respecting a far absent lover. Midnight came, and she still remained seated in company with Planchette, capitalized, impatient and despairing, and ready to dash the mocking toy to pieces. At length, she felt a slight thrill along her arms and a movement on the paper behind the pencil. At this crisis, her mother entered, but she heeded her not. Bending low, she asked, "Where is Richard?" "In heaven," was the instant response, written out in characters as copperplate-like as a writing master's, and the girl fell lifeless from the chair. Medical remedies, including shocks of electricity, were applied, but in vain.
Shocks of
It's just-
electricity.
right?
Okay.
I just imagine this like doctor in New Orleans like called up,
Yeah.
you know, for this like girl who's like died from sadness at the planchette, being like, well, might as well try electroshocking her.
Yeah.
Let's see if it works.
Yeah.
Like, when has that ever worked?
No, that's not.
I mean, I guess like I don't think like electricity like used for like heart attacks was like a thing.
No, I don't.
then.
No, I don't think so. I don't think they would
So-
have done it that way back then.
No, no. So when planchettes were big, they were really big. You know, there were all these articles about them. It was, you know, so many hits came up when I searched for it in newspapers. In 1868, a sheet music company published a piece called Planchette and dedicated it to Kirby, which is that planchette manufacturer that
Yeah.
kind of made it really popular. And then that same year, there was another song published by another company called Planchette. And then again the next year in 1870, there was another song called Planchette. It was really in the zeitgeist. People were really into planchettes. So what happened to planchettes? So it sounds like the introduction of the Ouija board in 1890 was the beginning of the end for planchettes, at least as an automatic writing device. Ouija boards were a lot easier to use and simpler, and you got answers a lot faster using a Ouija board than having to like have it written out. Also, I would imagine, I have not seen this anywhere, but just me guessing, you probably get better responses on a Ouija board.
Yeah.
Because automatic writing and like you probably often just get scribbles, like random scribbles.
That's what I was thinking too. Like it just would just be lines, like scribbles
Yeah.
everywhere.
You know, unless you're this guy interviewing the planchette.
Yeah. You
Or
get those
interviewing
pages and
planchette. Yeah. So it makes sense to me too. It's like, it's much easier to read something into a Ouija board where it says yes, no, you know, it spells out letters and stuff versus like scribbles on a page. And you're like, I guess that looks like an A.
Yeah.
So by the 1930s, there was one British toy company that was basically the last company really making planchettes in any kind of scale. After World War II, there was a revival of interest in Ouija boards, but planchettes weren't really being made anymore, so they didn't really come back as part of that revival. So while doing this research, I got really curious, and I was like, I want to experiment with a planchette. And I was like, it should be really easy to find one, right? Because like spiritualist stuff, occult stuff is so popular right now. Ouija boards are so popular right now.
Yeah.
I was like, surely this is like a thing that you can just like, there's probably going to be like 70 different people on Etsy who are selling it, right? So of course I searched planchette, and what comes up are a bunch of like, you know, earrings and shit like shaped like planchettes.
Like the Ouija board ones.
That's very tons
popular.
of Ouija boards. I was like, okay, whatever. So I searched planchette automatic writing, or I searched planchette writing, I guess. And there's 2 vendors on Etsy who sell them. And I was like, okay, I'll try Google shopping. I looked everywhere. These are the only 2 people I can find online that have like a legitimate seeming web presence who sell planchettes.
Wow.
So one of the people lives in Italy and sells planchettes that are like reproductions of the cool 1920s models, which come in boxes and are decorated, you know, like the old boxes back then. So it's actually really cool to look at those. I don't find them as aesthetically pleasing as the 19th century ones, but they're really cool looking. I'll link to them in the show notes. And like, it's really impressive that this person, I've been saying guy actually, but I don't know this person's gender, that this person makes these like really cool, historically accurate looking reproductions. And then there's also a vendor from right outside New Orleans who makes really beautiful handmade planchettes. So I actually ordered one of those.
Yes, amazing.
So that's coming in the mail, I think, next week. And I ordered the cheapest one I could find online, and it was still, after tax, like $80.
Holy shit.
They're not cheap.
Well, I guess if it's handmade as well, like...
Yeah. Exactly, because they're not mass-produced.
Yeah.
I guess they're probably harder to make than Ouija boards, because there's so many people online who make, like, you know, wooden, like burnt wood Ouija boards, but you don't need to add wheels to it. You don't need to make sure a pencil can fit right in it and like, be held in. So as easy as they were to manufacture in the 19th century, people are less handy these days, and it's still harder than a Ouija board, which literally, like you said, you can make it out of paper if you want to.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I was doing this research, and I was looking at it, and all I had gotten to in my research for the actual Ouija board was I had like 2 sentences. And then I had all of this stuff about the planchette.
That's cool, though.
So,
I like
next
this
week.
Stuff. So next week is about the Ouija boards?
Yes.
Cool.
Next week is about the invention of the Ouija board. Like, we'll talk about talking boards or spirit boards and Ouija boards. And I did actually this weekend read a lot about Ouija boards. Just the stuff that actually made it into my notes. Like, usually I gather a bunch of information and articles, read a bunch of stuff, and then decide how to present it in somewhat sort of narrative form. But it's really interesting. I'm excited for when we eventually get to Ouija board crimes.
Yeah.
I found that very fun too. That
sounds cool.
Yeah. But that's part 1 of question mark episodes about the Ouija board. I honestly don't know how many episodes this is going to be. I think it might be a lot because I was thinking the thing that I originally that I was trying to research, and then I went down this wormhole about Ouija boards and other things. I thought that just talking about her would be 2 or 3 episodes. So now, and I'm going to leave her out of pretty much all of these episodes, and we'll just present her on her own because I am reading one book about her, and I've read part of another book about her. I think those are the only 2 books that exist. But she was the Ouija board lady in the 19-teens and 20s. And she's interesting. Yeah. But first, why not talk about in great detail the whole history of Ouija boards?
I mean, I'm into it. And I want to get a tattoo of a planchette, I think. Yeah. But now, I'd already thought it looked cool, but now that I know the history of it as well, I really want to get one. And it's interesting that the design has stayed the same, with the hole in the corner and everything like that, and the little heart shape. Right. That's very cool.
It is really cool. I'm super into it. I wasn't even that into Ouija boards before. I've always liked them aesthetically, but I've always felt somewhat suspicious, superstitious, creeped out by them. Now I'm just really interested. And Amy was, saying oh, you could write a book about this. Yeah. It's who knows? I honestly can't even tell you how many pages of PDFs of articles I have about this whole thing.
You could do an illustrated guide to Ouija boards.
There we go. Yeah. Well, and I'm thinking in this series, I haven't even started about treating actual spirit communication. There's several books I want to read about spirit communication, but I'm not even really planning to touch the paranormal aspect of this. Yet. Yeah. I want to look at the historical stuff first. Yeah. Because I think it's such an interesting story. And I feel I don't see a lot about it. Mostly you just see pictures of Ouija boards, but not actual information. Yeah. But I could have, the series could get even longer if then I talk about what I've read in books about psychic and spirit communication, what I will have read in the future. I think this is also a real indication of I love reading. I spent pretty much 2 full days just reading articles about this, just this weekend. Wow. But it was too hard for me to read a book. Yeah. I read half a page of a book. Yeah. And I was to avoid having to read the rest of this book, what if I spend 16 hours, I actually don't know how long, many hours reading articles?
I do that too, because I guess it's smaller chunks of information. I find myself reading a lot of articles and stuff like that. But then when it comes to a book, I get really overwhelmed now, which I guess is it says a lot about how short my attention span has gotten because of the internet.
Exactly. Yeah. And also, I guess, I have my notes started on, that other topic related to Ouija boards. And I had gotten, so I, read the first 70 pages of the book, and I started taking notes, and I'm, 18 pages in, into the book in terms of my notes. And my notes are already, a page and a half long. And I'm this is so overwhelming. It's too much information. Why not inundate myself with even more information, but in smaller chunks?
Yeah. Yeah. Bite size.
So excited to talk more about the Ouija board next week.
Yeah, me too.
If people want to see the sources that I used here, and especially, I'll include the link to those Etsy storefronts and also to that really cool Planchette website with all the pictures and history of all the different manufacturers and stuff. That will be at BuriedSecretsPodcast.com. in the show notes. You can follow us on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast. You can email us at BuriedSecretsPodcast@gmail.com.
And you can follow me on Instagram at Jen Marie Wild.
And also, please rate, review, tell your friends, etc. That really will help other people find the podcast, and we'd really appreciate it. On Apple Podcasts, I know you can rate and review, but I think other podcatchers you can too. So please do that if you want to. Oh, and also we have a Patreon. That's patreon.com/buried secrets. And mostly right now, that's a repository for me posting random snippets of audio as I explore different things, like the Renwick Ruin on Roosevelt Island, like random cemeteries in Western Queens, etc. All right, that's it. Join us next week as we talk more about Ouija boards.